The lawyer's hand paused midair, hovering over a thin ivory envelope as 23 pairs of eyes locked onto me, waiting to see how I'd react when my name didn't get called. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old, and 3 days ago, I sat at a polished mahogany table in my grandmother's $2.8 million Connecticut home, while my entire family watched me get erased like I had never existed. They didn't whisper about it, they didn't look uncomfortable, they laughed, actually laughed, when Daniel Brooks, my grandmother's attorney, adjusted his glasses and said, "To my beloved granddaughter Olivia Carter, I leave the primary residence, all liquid assets totaling approximately $1.4 million, and full control of the Carter family trust." Olivia let out this small breathy laugh like she'd just won something she always knew was hers, and my father leaned back in his chair with that satisfied look I'd seen my whole life, like a decision had finally been made official, like the hierarchy we all pretended wasn't there had just been signed into law. I sat there waiting, hands folded in my lap, telling myself it wasn't over yet, that my grandmother wouldn't forget me, not after everything, not after those quiet afternoons in her sunroom where she used to say my name like it mattered. But then Daniel turned the page, and he didn't say my name, not once, not even as an afterthought, just a clean, clinical ending to a document that apparently had no room for me. Someone behind me chuckled. I think it was my cousin Mark, and Olivia actually glanced over at me with this soft, almost pitying smile that somehow felt worse than anything else, like I wasn't even worth being threatened by. My mother didn't look at me at all, just kept her eyes on the table like she always did when something uncomfortable happened, and my father finally said it out loud, low enough to sound casual but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, that makes sense. That makes sense." Like my entire existence in this family had always been a mistake waiting to be corrected. I remember staring at the grain of the table, counting the lines in the wood just to keep my face still, because I knew if I reacted, if I said anything, it would turn into exactly what they expected, me being dramatic, me making a scene, me proving their point that I didn't belong in rooms like this. For a second I actually believed it, that maybe I had imagined everything with my grandmother, that maybe all those conversations, all those quiet reassurances had just been me hearing what I wanted to hear. But then something didn't sit right, not the way Daniel's voice tightened just slightly when he closed the folder, not the way he didn't immediately stand up like the meeting wasn't actually over. Olivia was already talking about renovations, about knocking down a wall to open up the kitchen, like the house was hers before the ink even dried. And my father was nodding along, discussing contractors like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away, like I had already been edited out of the room, and that's when I heard it, just a small shift of paper, and Daniel cleared his throat again. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but something in the room changed, like the air tightened just a little, and he said, "Before we conclude, there is one additional item Miss Eleanor Carter instructed me to present." No one spoke, but I could feel the attention snap back, and for the first time since my name had been erased, Daniel looked directly at me, not past me, not through me, but at me, and there was something in his expression I couldn't read, something careful, something deliberate, as his hand reached for that thin ivory envelope I hadn't noticed before, the one sitting slightly apart from the rest of the documents like it didn't belong with them. I didn't realize it then, sitting there in that room where I had just been written out of my own family, but that single envelope was the only reason any of them would ever have to say my name again. Daniel did not open the envelope right away. He held it between his fingers like it carried weight beyond paper, and for a moment no one spoke, not even Olivia, who had just been planning out renovations like she was already living there, because something in his tone had shifted the room from celebration to hesitation, and I felt it too, that small, quiet pull of something not finished yet. My father was the first to break the silence, leaning forward slightly, voice controlled but edged with impatience, asking if there was any reason to delay the conclusion, and Daniel gave a polite, measured nod, the kind that did not ask permission, only acknowledged the question, before saying that my grandmother had been very specific about timing, about sequence, about how certain things were to be revealed only after the primary will had been read in full. Olivia laughed under her breath, not loudly this time, just enough for the people closest to her to hear, and said something about dramatic flair, like this was all just another performance arranged by a woman she had already decided was sentimental and outdated, and a few people smiled along with her, but no one fully relaxed, not anymore. I sat there with my hands still in my lap, but I could feel my pulse in my fingertips now because something about the way Daniel looked at me, directly, steadily, made it impossible to believe that I had imagined everything, that I had misunderstood my grandmother all those years. He turned the envelope over once, checking the seal, and I recognized the handwriting immediately, even from across the table. Eleanor Carter, written in that firm, slightly slanted script that had signed every birthday card, every note she ever left for me, every small reminder that I had not been invisible to at least one person in this family. I did not realize then how carefully she had planned this, how every step had been arranged long before any of us sat down at that table. But I remembered something she said to me 6 months before she passed, sitting in her sunroom while the late afternoon light hit the glass just right. She had looked at me over her tea and said, "Emily, not everything important is written where people expect to find it." And at the time I thought she was talking about life, about choices, about something abstract and philosophical, not a moment where my entire place in this family was being decided by a second piece of paper. Daniel finally broke the seal, slow enough that every small sound seemed louder than it should have been, the faint tear of adhesive, the slide of paper against paper, and I noticed my father shift in his seat, not comfortable anymore, not certain, while my mother finally looked up for the first time since the reading began, her eyes moving from Daniel to the envelope and then briefly to me before dropping again like she was not ready to witness whatever came next. Olivia crossed her arms, her earlier confidence still there but thinner now, less certain, like she could feel the attention slipping away from her just slightly, and that alone was enough to make her tense. Daniel pulled out a single sheet, thicker than standard paper, and glanced at it before looking back at the room, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of weight, not formal, not detached but deliberate, like every word had been chosen long before he ever stepped into this house. He said that this document was not part of the original will, that it had been prepared separately under direct instruction and was to be read only after all beneficiaries had been acknowledged, and I felt something shift inside me at that word beneficiaries, because for the first time since my name had been erased, it sounded like there might be more to the story than what everyone had already decided was final. Olivia exhaled sharply, almost a laugh but not quite, and said this was unnecessary, that everything had already been settled, but Daniel did not look at her. He did not respond to her at all. He kept his focus on the page and then on me, and that was when I understood, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know that whatever was written there had something to do with me, something none of them had expected, something my grandmother had kept hidden until this exact moment. I did not realize then how much that single sheet of paper was about to change, not just the room, but every assumption they had ever made about who I was in this family. Daniel lowered his eyes to the page for just a second before he began, and when he spoke, the room did not just quiet down, it seemed to hold its breath, like every person at that table knew instinctively that whatever came next was not meant to be ignored, and he said, "This document is a supplementary directive prepared by Eleanor Carter on March 14th of this year, witnessed and notarized separately from her primary will," and I watched my father's expression tighten just slightly at the date, because that was 2 weeks before she was admitted to the hospital, 2 weeks before anyone thought she was declining, which meant she had been clear, intentional, and fully aware of what she was doing. Olivia shifted in her chair, her arms still crossed, but now there was something sharper in her posture, something defensive, and she said under her breath that this was unnecessary, that the will had already been finalized. But Daniel continued as if she had not spoken at all, his voice steady, precise, like he had read these words more than once before today. "In the event that my estate is distributed in a manner that reflects only surface-level evaluation of worth, I have prepared an additional instruction to correct that imbalance," he read, and there was a pause, a real one this time, not for effect but because the words themselves seemed to land in the room with weight, and I felt something inside my chest tighten, not pain, not yet, but recognition, because that sounded like her. That sounded exactly like the way she used to talk when she thought no one else was paying attention. My father leaned forward again, his tone controlled but firmer now, asking Daniel what exactly that meant, and for the first time Daniel looked directly at him, not deferential, not uncertain, just calm, and said it meant he would continue reading as instructed. My mother finally lifted her head fully, her eyes moving between them, and I could see the unease there, the kind she always tried to hide, while Olivia let out a short breath that was almost a laugh but did not carry the same confidence as before. Daniel continued, "This directive applies specifically to my granddaughter Emily Carter," and for a second I thought I had imagined it, that my name had not actually been spoken, because it had been so completely absent just moments ago. But then every head at the table turned toward me at once, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. I did not move, I did not even breathe differently, but inside something shifted. something that had been sitting quietly for years, waiting to be acknowledged. Daniel read on. Emily has been evaluated by this family according to criteria that prioritize visibility over substance, performance over integrity, and convenience over character. And I heard a chair creak somewhere to my left, someone adjusting, someone uncomfortable, but no one interrupted him now, not even Olivia. My father's jaw tightened, and he said my grandmother had been confused toward the end, that she had not always been clear, but Daniel did not pause. He did not acknowledge the comment, he simply continued reading. This document exists to ensure that what has been overlooked is not erased, and what has been dismissed is not discarded. And I felt my hands press slightly into my lap, grounding myself, because this was no longer about being left out. This was about something being set right in a way none of them had expected. Olivia finally spoke louder this time, saying this was absurd, that everything had already been decided legally. But Daniel lifted the page slightly and said that this directive was legally binding, filed with the same authority as the primary will, and that any objection could be addressed after the reading was complete. The room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not dismissive, not amused, but uncertain, like the ground beneath them had shifted just enough to make everyone aware of it. Daniel looked back down at the page and then at me again, and there was something almost deliberate in the way he said the next line, like he understood exactly what moment this was. Emily Carter is the sole designated recipient of assets not disclosed within the primary will, as outlined in the attached documentation, and I felt the words land before I fully understood them, because the meaning was still unfolding, still forming, and yet I knew, even before he continued, that whatever came next was not something they could laugh at, not something they could dismiss, not something they had prepared for, but I did not realize then just how much had been hidden from them, or how carefully my grandmother had made sure that the real story would only begin after they thought it was already over. For a second, no one reacted, like the words had not fully reached them yet, like the meaning was still catching up to the moment, and I could see it in their faces, that slow shift from confidence to confusion, especially in Olivia, whose expression tightened just slightly as she tried to process what assets not disclosed could possibly mean, because in her mind, everything had already been accounted for, everything had already been claimed. My father was the first to speak again, his voice sharper now, no longer casual, asking Daniel to clarify exactly what assets were being referenced, and there was a controlled tension in the way he said it, like he was already trying to contain something he did not yet understand. Daniel did not rush his response. He glanced down at the document again, then at a second sheet attached behind it, thicker, stamped, official, and he said that the supplementary directive included a detailed inventory that had been intentionally separated from the primary will, and that this inventory had been filed under a different holding structure established by Eleanor Carter 5 years prior. 5 years. The number landed in my mind immediately because that was long before any of us had any reason to think about inheritance, long before hospital visits or legal discussions, which meant this had not been a last-minute decision, this had been planned deliberately, carefully, over time. Olivia let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking her head slightly as if dismissing the idea before it could fully form, saying that everything my grandmother owned was already listed, already reviewed, that there could not possibly be anything significant left unaccounted for, and a few people at the table nodded faintly, clinging to that assumption because it was simpler, because it kept the world in the shape they expected. Daniel met her gaze briefly, not confrontational, just steady, and said that the assets in question were not part of the publicly managed estate, and had never been disclosed within the family's standard financial summaries, and I watched as that statement moved through the room, quiet but heavy, like a realization no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. My mother's hand tightened around the edge of the table, her knuckles pale, and my father leaned back slightly this time, not in confidence but in recalculation, like he was already running through possibilities in his head, trying to understand how something like that could exist without his knowledge. I stayed still, but inside everything felt different now, not because I understood what was happening but because for the first time I could see that they did not understand either. Daniel turned the page and continued, his voice unchanged. The assets held under this separate structure include, but are not limited to, a private investment portfolio established in 2019, real property holdings in 3 states, and a controlling interest in Carter Development Group LLC. And that was the moment the room shifted completely, because Carter Development Group was not just another asset, it was the company my father had spent the last 20 years building his reputation around, the company he always spoke about like it was his, even though it had technically originated under my grandmother's name. Olivia's expression changed first, the certainty dropping away, replaced by something sharper, something almost alarmed, and she turned to my father as if expecting him to correct it, to explain it, but he did not speak right away, and that silence said more than anything else could have. Daniel continued. These assets have been legally transferred into a trust structure with Emily Carter named as the sole controlling beneficiary, effective immediately upon the reading of this directive. And I felt the words before I fully understood them, felt the weight of them settle into the space that had been empty just moments ago. Because this was not symbolic, this was not sentimental, this was real, structured, documented authority. Someone at the far end of the table shifted their chair abruptly, the sound loud in the silence, and Olivia finally spoke again, louder now. Her voice edged with disbelief, saying that there must be a mistake, that this could not override the primary will, that it did not make sense, but Daniel shook his head slightly and said that the directive had been structured specifically to operate independently of the will, not in conflict with it, but alongside it, ensuring that certain assets would never be subject to redistribution or reinterpretation. I could feel every eye in the room on me now, not with dismissal, not with amusement, but with something entirely different, something uncertain, something measuring, like they were seeing me for the first time in a context they had not prepared for. And I did not realize then just how far this would go, or how deeply it would unravel everything they thought they controlled, but I knew one thing clearly in that moment. The story they believed had already ended was only just beginning. No one laughed this time, not even Olivia, and the silence that followed Daniel's last sentence felt heavier than anything that had come before, like the entire room had shifted into a reality none of them had prepared for, and I could see it in the way my father's posture changed, no longer relaxed, no longer certain, but calculated, alert, like he was already trying to understand what control he still had left. He leaned forward slowly, his voice measured but sharper now, asking Daniel to repeat exactly what had just been said, and Daniel did not hesitate, did not soften it. He simply repeated that the controlling interest in Carter Development Group LLC had been transferred into a trust with me as the sole controlling beneficiary, effective immediately. The word controlling hung in the air longer than anything else because it was not passive, it was not symbolic, it meant authority, it meant decision-making, it meant power in a way this family had never associated with me before. Olivia shook her head again, but this time there was no amusement in it, only disbelief, and she said that it did not make sense, that she had just been named primary beneficiary of the estate, that she had just been given everything, and Daniel corrected her calmly, saying that she had been given everything that was listed in the primary will, not everything that existed. That distinction landed hard, and I watched as it moved across the table, across faces that had just minutes ago been confident, satisfied, settled, now forced to recalculate what everything actually meant. My mother finally spoke, her voice quieter, uncertain, asking how something like this could have been kept hidden, and Daniel explained that the structure had been intentionally private, managed through an external firm, with documentation filed under separate legal channels that did not require disclosure within the family's internal financial reviews. My father's expression tightened further at that because this was not just about money, this was about information, about access, about the fact that something significant had existed outside of his knowledge, outside of his control for years. I could feel the shift in how they were looking at me now, not as someone to ignore, not as someone to dismiss, but as a variable they had not accounted for. And that alone felt unfamiliar, almost unreal, because for so long I had existed in the background of every room, present but not considered, included but not valued. Olivia leaned forward suddenly, her voice sharper now, asking what exactly I was supposed to do with that kind of control, like the idea itself was absurd, like it needed to be challenged before it could fully settle into reality. And for the first time since the reading began, I spoke, my voice steady, quieter than hers but clear, saying that I did not know yet, and that answer seemed to unsettle her even more, because it was not defensive, it was not reactive, it was simply honest. Daniel turned another page, continuing, saying that the directive also included operational authority effective immediately, meaning that any decisions regarding Carter Development Group would require my approval moving forward, and I saw my father's reaction to that before he said anything, the slight shift in his shoulders, the tightening of his jaw, because this was no longer abstract, this was immediate. This affected him directly, his position, his authority, his identity within the company he had always presented as his own. He spoke again, more firmly now, saying that there must be a process, a transition period, something that allowed for continuity, and Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the question, but clarified that the directive had been structured to avoid delay, that the transition was effective as of the reading, not subject to internal approval or adjustment. The room felt different now, not just quiet, but tense, like every person was aware that something fundamental had changed, and no one quite knew how to respond to it yet. I sat there, still in the same chair in the same position, but everything around me felt altered, like the space itself had shifted, and I realized something in that moment, something simple but undeniable, that for the first time in my life I was not the one being evaluated, I was the one they were waiting on, the one they were watching, the one they needed to understand, and I did not realize then just how much that shift would change the way they treated me, or how quickly their certainty would turn into something else entirely, but I could feel it beginning, right there, in the silence that no one knew how to break. No one reached for their water, no one checked their phone, even the small habitual movements that usually filled silence were gone, because the balance in that room had shifted in a way none of them could ignore, and for the first time I could see hesitation where there had only ever been certainty. My father was the one who broke it, but his voice had changed, less declarative, more controlled, like he was choosing every word carefully now, asking Daniel what exactly operational authority meant in practical terms, and Daniel answered without hesitation, explaining that it meant all executive decisions, strategic approvals, and financial authorizations tied to Carter Development Group would now require my direct consent, effective immediately, not after a meeting, not after a review, but now. The word now seemed to echo longer than anything else, because it removed the idea of delay, of adjustment, of time to negotiate. Olivia let out a slow breath, but it was not frustration anymore, it was something closer to disbelief settling into reality, and she looked at me differently this time, not with that soft dismissal she had worn her entire life, but with something sharper, something measuring, like she was trying to understand how I had become relevant in a way she could not control. My mother shifted in her chair, finally turning fully toward me, and there was something in her expression I had not seen before, not quite support, not quite fear, but awareness, like she was realizing that the version of me she had always accepted without question might not have been the full picture. Daniel continued, turning another page, saying that the directive also included a clause regarding executive transition, that any current leadership positions held within the company would remain intact only under the condition of compliance with the new controlling structure, and that any resistance or attempt to bypass that structure would trigger an automatic review process led by the external firm managing the trust. That was when my father leaned back slightly, not in comfort but in recognition, because this was no longer just about authority, this was about limitation, about the boundaries placed around what he could and could not do moving forward. He asked more directly now whether that meant his role as managing director was subject to my approval, and Daniel answered simply yes. One word, no explanation, no softening, just yes. The silence that followed was different from before, not uncertain, not confused, but heavy with understanding, because there was no longer anything unclear about what this meant. Olivia's voice came next, quicker, sharper, asking how something like this could have been decided without the family's involvement, and Daniel responded that it had been decided by the legal owner of the assets, Eleanor Carter, under full capacity and with documented intent, and that the structure had been designed specifically to operate independently of family consensus. That phrase seemed to land harder than anything else, independently of family consensus, because it cut directly through the assumption that everything in this family required agreement, approval, alignment. I sat there, still in the same place, but I could feel the shift in how they were orienting themselves around me now, not physically but mentally, like I had moved from the edge of their awareness to the center of their calculations. My father looked at me then, directly, really looked at me in a way he had not in years, and there was something different in that look, not warmth, not pride, but acknowledgement, like he was finally recognizing that the structure he had relied on, the one where I existed at the bottom, no longer applied. He asked me, not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly, what I intended to do with that authority, and for a second the room felt like it was waiting again, not for Daniel this time but for me. I did not answer right away, not because I did not have something to say, but because for the first time I understood that my response mattered, that it would shape what came next, and I remembered something my grandmother had told me years ago, something simple, almost casual at the time, that power is not proven by how quickly you use it, but by how well you understand it before you do. So I looked back at him, steady, and said that I was still listening, and that answer, quiet as it was, seemed to shift the room once more, because they realized I was not reacting, I was observing, and I did not realize then just how much that would unsettle them, or how quickly they would begin to adjust their behavior in response, but I could see it starting right there in the way no one interrupted, no one laughed, no one dismissed me anymore. No one spoke after that, not immediately, because something had changed in a way that could not be reversed with a quick comment or a dismissive laugh. And I could see it in the way Olivia sat back slightly, no longer leaning forward like she owned the room, but holding herself still, watching, calculating, like she was trying to figure out where she stood now in a structure that had just been rewritten without her consent. My father was still looking at me, but not the way he used to, not like I was an afterthought or a responsibility he tolerated, but like I was a variable he had not accounted for, and I could tell he was trying to decide how to approach me, not as a daughter, but as someone with authority he could not ignore. Daniel closed the folder slowly, not rushing, not signaling an end, just allowing the moment to settle, and then he said that copies of all documents would be distributed for review, and that any formal discussions regarding implementation could be scheduled with his office, but until then, the directive stood exactly as written. That was when my father shifted again, this time leaning forward slightly, his tone more controlled than before, asking if there was room for internal alignment before any operational changes took place, and Daniel responded that alignment could be discussed, but authority had already been assigned, and that distinction seemed to land with more weight than anything else, because it made it clear that whatever conversations happened next would not change the structure, only how people adapted to. Olivia let out a quiet breath, her fingers tapping lightly against the table, a habit I had seen my whole life whenever she was thinking quickly, and she said that it would make sense for us to talk privately, to make sure everyone was on the same page, and the way she said us felt different, like she was including me now, not out of habit but out of necessity. I noticed that immediately, the shift in language, the subtle repositioning, and it did not feel like inclusion, it felt like adjustment. My mother finally spoke again, her voice softer, almost careful, saying that maybe we should take a moment, that this was a lot to process, and for once, no one dismissed her suggestion, no one redirected the conversation, because everyone understood that the ground had already shifted beneath them. I stayed where I was, not moving to stand, not reaching for anything, just observing, because for the first time I was not trying to keep up with the room was trying to understand me. My father looked at Daniel again, asking about timelines, about next steps, about how quickly decisions would need to be made, and Daniel answered that there was no imposed deadline, but that all current operations would now require my approval moving forward, meaning that any delay in engagement could affect continuity. That was when the reality of it settled fully, not just for them but for me, because this was not something that would happen later, this was already happening, already active, already in motion. Olivia turned toward me again, her expression more composed now, but there was an edge to it, something controlled, and she said that we should sit down later, just the two of us, to talk through everything, and for a moment I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was so clearly different from every interaction we had ever had before, because she had never once asked to talk, not like this, not with intention, not with the assumption that my input mattered. I nodded slightly, not agreeing, not committing, just acknowledging, and that seemed to be enough for now. My father watched that exchange closely, and I could see him adjusting in real time, recalibrating how he spoke, how he positioned himself, and when he finally addressed me again, his tone was different, not soft but measured, asking if I would be available to review the company's current structure with him in the coming days. And that question alone carried more weight than anything he had said to me in years, because it was not an instruction, it was a request. I did not answer right away, not because I wanted to delay, but because I understood now that timing mattered, that response mattered, and I said that I would review the documents first, and that seemed to settle something in him, not resolution but direction, like he knew where to begin. I did not realize then how quickly these conversations would shift, how fast respect could replace dismissal when power changed hands, but I could feel it starting, in the way they spoke, in the way they waited, in the way no one in that room saw me the same way anymore. The room did not break into conversation the way it normally would after something like this. There was no immediate movement, no chairs scraping back all at once, no overlapping voices trying to regain control of the moment. Instead, people stood slower, quieter, like they were recalculating where they belonged in a space that no longer followed the rules they understood. Daniel gathered his documents with deliberate precision, placing the primary will and the supplementary directive into separate folders, and when he handed one to me, his expression was calm but intentional, like he knew exactly what he was placing in my hands was not just paper, it was leverage, structure, authority that had already begun to reshape the room before anyone even left it. My father stood next, adjusting his jacket in that automatic way he always did when he needed to regain composure. But it was not quite the same this time. There was a pause in it, a fraction of hesitation, and he looked at me again, not speaking immediately, as if he was deciding how to approach me in a context he had never had to consider before. Olivia was already moving toward the sideboard, pouring herself a glass of water, but I noticed her hands were not as steady as usual, just slightly off, just enough to show that the confidence she had walked in with had not left the room intact. My mother remained seated for a moment longer, watching everything, her eyes moving between us, and I could tell she was trying to understand not just what had happened, but what it meant going forward, how it would change the patterns she had relied on for years without ever questioning them. One by one, the others in the room began to disperse, quieter than they had arrived, conversations lower, more controlled, because no one wanted to say the wrong thing now, not when the balance had shifted so visibly. I stood up last, not in a rush, holding the folder in my hands, feeling its weight not physically, but in what it represented, and as I did, Olivia stepped closer, her voice lower now, controlled, asking if we could talk somewhere private, just for a few minutes, and there was something in the way she said it that was almost careful, like she was choosing not to push, not to assume, but to ask. I looked at her for a second, noticing the difference in her posture, the way she held herself slightly back instead of leaning in, and I said that I needed time to go through everything first, and that answer seemed to land differently than it would have before, not as resistance but as a boundary. She nodded once, quick, and stepped back, and that alone told me more than anything she could have said, because Olivia Carter did not step back, not from anyone, not until now. My father approached next, slower, more deliberate, and he said that there were operational matters that would need immediate attention, that certain approvals could not wait, and there was an edge of urgency in his voice, but also something else, something restrained, like he was holding himself back from pushing too hard. I met his gaze and said that I would review the documents tonight and be available tomorrow morning, and that seemed to give him something to work with, a timeline, a structure, and he nodded, not sharply, not dismissively, but with acknowledgement. That was new too. As people moved out into the hallway, I stayed behind for a moment, letting the room empty, letting the silence settle fully now that the tension had shifted into something quieter, more controlled, and I looked down at the folder again, at my name printed clearly on the front, Emily Carter, not as an afterthought, not as an omission, but as the center of something that had been built without anyone else knowing. I thought about my grandmother then, about the way she used to watch everything without interrupting, the way she noticed things no one else paid attention to, and I realized that none of this had been accidental, none of it had been reactive, it had all been planned, layered, timed. I did not know yet exactly what I was stepping into, how complex it would be, how much it would require from me, but I knew one thing clearly: I was no longer standing outside the structure of this family, I was standing at a point where everything flowed through me, and as I walked out of that room I could feel the shift following me, not behind me, not fading but moving with me, because whatever came next was no longer something they would decide without me. The hallway felt longer than it had when I walked in, not because the distance had changed but because every step carried something different now, something heavier, something that followed me in the way people looked up when I passed, in the way conversations lowered just slightly as I moved by, like my presence had shifted from background noise to something that needed to be acknowledged. I stepped outside into the late afternoon air, the Connecticut breeze cooler than I expected, and for a moment I just stood there on the front steps of the house that had never really felt like mine, holding a folder that somehow changed everything about how I existed in relation to it. My car was parked exactly where I left it, a few spaces down from Olivia's, and I noticed the small things now, the difference in placement, the way her car had always been closer, more visible, more central, and I almost smiled at how natural that had always seemed before, how unquestioned. I got into the driver's seat and sat there for a second, not starting the engine, just placing the folder on the passenger seat and letting my hands rest on the steering wheel, because I needed a moment to catch up with what had just happened, to process something that had not only shifted the room but had shifted something inside me too. When I finally drove away, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the weight of what had been handed to me did not fade with distance. It stayed steady, present, like something waiting to be understood. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was lower, casting that late afternoon light across the living room floor, and everything inside looked exactly the same as it had that morning, the same couch, the same stack of unopened mail, the same quiet, except I was not the same person who had left earlier. I placed the folder on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, staring at it, because opening it felt like crossing another line, like moving from reaction into responsibility, And I knew once I started there would be no going back to not knowing. I finally sat down, pulled the folder closer and opened it carefully, flipping through the pages one by one, not rushing because every detail mattered now. The first document outlined the trust structure, the legal language, precise, clear, leaving no room for interpretation, and I saw my name again, repeated, defined, positioned not as a beneficiary in the passive sense, but as the controlling authority, the one through whom decisions would flow. I kept reading, moving to the asset breakdown, and that was when the scale of it started to settle in, not just numbers but structure, properties listed across 3 states, a portfolio with allocations I had never seen before, investments that had been growing quietly for years without any mention in family discussions, without any acknowledgement in the financial summaries I had occasionally overheard but never been part of. Then I reached the section on Carter Development Group, and this time I slowed down, reading every line carefully because this was not just an asset, this was the center of everything my father had built his identity around, and now it was tied to me in a way I had never been prepared for. I leaned back slightly, letting the information settle, and for a moment I felt something close to overwhelm, not because it was too much, but because it was unexpected, because I had spent so many years not being included that being central felt unfamiliar. But then something else followed, quieter, steadier, a sense of clarity, because this was not random, this was not accidental, it had been planned, structured, and given to me with intention. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me out of my thoughts, and I glanced down to see Olivia's name on the screen, the first message coming through, short, direct, asking if we could talk tonight, just the two of us, and I stared at it for a second before setting the phone back down without responding, not out of avoidance, but because I understood now that timing mattered, that response mattered, and that for the first time, I was not the one waiting for permission to speak. I turned back to the documents, flipping to the final page, and that was when I saw it, a handwritten note attached at the end, not typed, not formal, but personal, unmistakably hers, and I did not realize then just how much those few lines would change the way I understood everything that had just happened, but I could already feel it, even before I read it, that whatever she had left me was not just authority, it was something more, something I had not fully grasped yet. I stared at the handwritten note for a long second before I touched it, because something about it felt different from everything else in that folder, less formal, less distant, more like her, and when I finally picked it up, I recognized the paper immediately, the same cream-colored stationery she used for letters, the same faint indentation where her pen pressed harder on certain words. I unfolded it slowly, and the first line was simple, just my name, Emily, written in that familiar script, and for a moment everything else faded, the documents, the numbers, the structure, all of it, because that was the first time that day my name had been written without condition, without comparison, without being measured against someone else. I took a breath and kept reading. She wrote that if I was reading this, it meant the rest of the room had already made their assumptions, that they had already decided what I was worth based on what they could see, and she said that was exactly why she had done things the way she did, not to punish them but to reveal them. I paused on that line because it did not feel like revenge, it felt like something more deliberate, more controlled. She wrote that for years she had watched how decisions were made in that family, who was heard, who was ignored, who was given space to grow and who was expected to stay small, and she said she had seen me adapt in ways no one else had noticed, learning to observe, to understand, to move without needing validation. I felt something tighten in my chest as I read that, because she had noticed, she had been paying attention the entire time, even when it felt like no one else was. She wrote that power given too early is often wasted, but power given at the right moment reveals character, not creates it, and that line stayed with me longer than anything else because it reframed everything. This was not about suddenly becoming something new, it was about being seen for what I had already been. I kept reading, slower now, taking in every word. She said that the structure she built was not just about assets, it was about responsibility, about how I chose to use what had been given to me. And she made one thing clear, that I was not obligated to follow the patterns I had grown up in, that I was not required to maintain a system that had never valued me, and that whatever I decided to do next would define not just the future of the company, but the future of how this family understood value itself. I leaned back slightly, the paper still in my hands, and for a moment everything felt very quiet, not empty but settled, like the noise from earlier had finally faded enough for me to think clearly. My phone buzzed again on the table, another message, this time from my father, shorter than Olivia's, more direct, asking what time I would be available in the morning to begin reviewing operational priorities, and I noticed the wording, not telling, not assuming but asking, and that alone would have felt impossible just hours earlier. I placed the note back on the table carefully, not rushing, because I understood now that every response, every decision from this point forward would carry weight, not just in what it changed but in how it was perceived. I looked back at the documents spread across the table, the trust structure, the asset breakdown, the operational clauses, and then at the note again because that was the part that mattered most, not what I had been given but why. I picked up my phone not to respond immediately but to check the time because I wanted to be deliberate, not reactive, and as I set it back down I realized something that had not been clear before, that this was not about proving anything to them, not about correcting the past or forcing acknowledgement, it was about deciding what came next on my terms. I did not realize then how quickly those decisions would start to test me, how the conversations the next day would shift in ways I could not fully anticipate, but I knew one thing clearly as I sat there, reading her words again, that whatever they thought they understood about me was already outdated, and they just did not know it yet. The next morning did not feel like a continuation of the day before, it felt like a reset, like everything had been rewritten overnight, and now everyone was waking up into a version of reality they had not agreed to but could not deny. I arrived at the Carter Development Group office building at 8:15 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than the time my father had suggested, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to see the space before it adjusted to me, before people started performing differently, before the dynamic shifted in real time. The building looked exactly the same from the outside, glass and steel, clean lines, understated wealth, the kind of place that did not need to announce its value because it assumed you already knew. I walked through the front doors and the receptionist looked up, her expression neutral for half a second before recognition clicked in, followed by something else, something more attentive, more deliberate, and she greeted me by name, not casually but carefully, like it mattered how she said it. That was new. I took the elevator to the executive floor, the same floor I had been on once before years ago for a holiday event. When I had stood near the back of the room holding a drink I did not finish while Olivia moved easily through conversations, introducing herself, being seen, being remembered. Today, when the elevator doors opened, the energy was different, quieter, more controlled, and I could feel eyes shift toward me as I stepped out. Not openly staring but aware enough to register that something had changed. My father was already in the conference room, standing near the window with a folder in his hand, and when he turned to see me, there was no hesitation in his expression this time, no dismissal, just focus, like he had already accepted the new structure and was choosing how to operate within it. He greeted me with a simple good morning, and I returned it the same way, no extra tone, no attempt to fill the space with something unnecessary. Olivia was there too, seated at the table, a laptop open in front of her, and she looked up as I entered, her posture composed, controlled, but I could see the effort in it now, the intention behind every movement, every glance. There were two other executives in the room, both men I recognized from past mentions but had never been introduced to directly, and when my father made the introductions he did not rush through them, he did not generalize, he spoke clearly, positioning me not as a guest, not as family, but as the controlling authority tied to the trust structure, and I noticed the shift in how they responded, the immediate adjustment in their posture, their tone, their attention. We sat down and my father began outlining the current operational priorities, revenue projections, ongoing developments, speaking in the same structured way he always had, but there was a difference now, a slight pause after each key point, like he was leaving space for me to respond, not assuming I would but acknowledging that I could. I listened, not interrupting, not reacting immediately, just taking it in because I understood that the first response would set a tone, not just for this meeting but for everything that followed. When he finished the initial overview, there was a moment of quiet, not uncomfortable but expectant, and I could feel all of them waiting, not for a reaction but for direction. I looked down at the documents I had reviewed the night before, then back at him, and I asked one question, simple, direct, about a line item in the financial summary that did not align with the investment allocations listed in the trust documents. It was not a challenge, not an accusation, just a question, but I watched the effect it had immediately, the way the room shifted slightly, the way my father paused for half a second longer than usual before answering, the way Olivia's attention sharpened just a bit more, because they realized something in that moment, that I was not just present, I understood more than they expected. He answered, explaining the discrepancy, and I nodded, not pressing further, not yet, because this was not about proving anything, it was about establishing how I would operate, how I would observe before I acted. The meeting continued, moving through details, projections, timelines, and with each exchange I could feel the dynamic settling into something new, something that did not resemble what it had been before. They were not talking around me, they were talking to me, waiting, adjusting, recalibrating in real time. I did not realize then how quickly this would become the new normal, how fast people adapt when the structure changes, but I could see it beginning, in the way every word was measured, every response considered, because for the first time I was not just part of the conversation, I was the one shaping where it went next. By the time the meeting moved into its second hour, the shift was no longer subtle, it was fully established, and I could see it in the way conversations no longer circled around me but passed through me, like every decision now had a checkpoint it never had before. My father continued presenting updates, but his rhythm had changed, slower, more deliberate, leaving space after each key point, and I understood that he was not just explaining anymore, he was positioning, adapting to a structure where his authority was no longer absolute. Olivia contributed next, outlining a proposed expansion project, her tone confident, polished, exactly the way she had always spoken in these rooms, but there was something underneath it now, something more controlled, like she was aware that confidence alone was no longer enough, that it needed to land differently. I listened carefully, not interrupting, letting her finish completely before I responded, because I knew that timing mattered more than volume, and when I did speak I did not challenge her directly. I asked a question about the projected return timeline compared to the capital allocation listed in the trust documents. It was a small question on the surface, but I watched the effect it had immediately, the way her expression tightened for just a second before she adjusted, the way the two executives at the table shifted their attention toward her, waiting for her response with a different kind of focus than before. She answered, explaining the projections, but there was a slight hesitation in it, not enough to call out, but enough to be noticed, and I nodded, not pressing further, not correcting, just acknowledging, because this was not about confrontation, it was about establishing a standard. My father stepped in smoothly after that, reinforcing her point, but I could tell he was recalibrating as he spoke, adjusting how he framed information, how he structured explanations, because he understood now that every detail could be questioned not aggressively but precisely. The meeting continued, moving through departments, budgets, timelines, and with each exchange the pattern became clearer. They were no longer presenting information as conclusions, they were presenting it as something that required alignment, something that needed to pass through a new layer of review. At one point, one of the executives suggested a minor adjustment to a vendor contract, something that would have normally been approved on the spot, and instead of agreeing immediately, my father glanced at me first, just briefly, but it was enough to signal to everyone in the room that the process had changed. I did not respond right away, I let the silence sit for a moment, not to create tension but to make space for thought, and then I asked for a summary of the contract terms and the long-term implications, and that request alone shifted the tone again because it made it clear that speed was no longer the priority, clarity was. Olivia watched that exchange closely, her posture still composed, but her attention sharper now, like she was tracking every move, every decision, trying to understand the pattern I was building, not just what I was saying but how I was saying it. When the discussion moved toward leadership structure, my father paused slightly longer than before, and I knew he was choosing his words carefully, because this was the part that affected him most directly. He outlined the current hierarchy, the reporting lines, the decision flow, and then he stopped just enough to indicate that the next step was not his to define alone. I looked at the chart in front of me, at the structure that had existed for years without my involvement, and I realized something in that moment, that I did not need to dismantle it to change it, I only needed to redirect how it functioned. So I said that the current structure would remain in place for now, but that all executive decisions would require documented justification aligned with long-term strategy, not just short-term outcomes, and I watched the reaction carefully, the way the two executives nodded slightly, the way Olivia's expression shifted into something more analytical, the way my father accepted it without resistance, because it was not a rejection of his system, it was a refinement of it, and that made it harder to push against. The meeting began to wind down after that, not because everything had been resolved, but because a new framework had been established, one that would carry into every conversation moving forward. As people started gathering their notes, standing, adjusting, I remained seated for a moment longer, not out of hesitation but out of awareness, because I could feel the difference now, not just in how they spoke, but in how they waited, how they observed, how they positioned themselves around me. I did not realize then how much this would extend beyond this room, how quickly it would reshape interactions outside of work, but I could already see the foundation forming, the beginning of a dynamic where I was no longer responding to their expectations, they were adjusting to mine. By the time I walked out of the conference room, the shift was no longer contained to that table, it had followed me into the hallway, into the way people stepped slightly aside, into the way conversations paused just long enough to register my presence, and I realized this was not a moment, it was a transition, something that would continue unfolding long after that meeting ended. My father walked beside me for a few steps, not speaking immediately, and that silence felt different from the ones I had known growing up, not dismissive, not indifferent, but measured, like he was choosing what to say with more care than he ever had before. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, controlled, but there was something else in it now, something closer to respect, and he said that the framework I suggested made sense, that it aligned with long-term stability, and I recognized what that was. Not agreement for the sake of peace, but acknowledgement of authority. I nodded once, not overextending the moment, because I understood now that not every shift needed to be emphasized, some simply needed to be accepted. Olivia joined us a few seconds later, her pace matching ours, her posture composed, but I could see the adjustment in the way she held herself, the way she spoke, more precise, more intentional, and she said that the project she had outlined could be restructured to better align with the new criteria, and I heard the difference immediately, not presenting, not asserting, but aligning. That word would have felt unnatural coming from her before, but now it fit because the structure had changed, and she was adapting to it in real time. We stopped near the elevator, and for a brief moment, the three of us stood there without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. My father looked at me again, not the way he had in the past, not evaluating, not comparing, but directly, and he said that he would send over a full operational summary by the end of the day, and that we could schedule a follow-up to go deeper into strategy, and again it was a request, not an expectation. I said that would work, simple, direct, and that was enough. The elevator arrived, the doors opened, and as we stepped inside, I caught my reflection briefly in the mirrored panel, and for a second it felt unfamiliar, not because I had changed physically, but because the context around me had shifted so completely that it altered how I saw myself within it. When the doors closed and the elevator began to descend, I thought about the day before, about that moment at the table when my name had not been read, when they had laughed, when everything about my place in that family had been defined by absence, and I compared it to now, to the way every conversation had adjusted, every tone had shifted, every decision now passed through me. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was undeniable. When I stepped out of the building and into the late morning light, the city moved the same way it always did, people walking, cars passing, everything continuing without pause, and I realized something simple but clear, that nothing external had changed, the world had not rearranged itself, but my position within it had, and that was enough to alter everything. My phone buzzed in my hand, another message, this time from Daniel, confirming that all documents had been finalized and filed, that everything was now officially in effect, and I read it once, then again, not because I needed to, but because it made it real in a way that went beyond the room, beyond the conversations, beyond perception. I looked back up at the building for a moment, at the glass reflecting the sky, and I thought about my grandmother, about the way she had watched quietly for years, the way she had understood something no one else had. That value is not assigned by volume or visibility, it is revealed by how someone moves when no one is paying attention. I did not need to prove anything to them, I did not need to correct the past or force recognition, because that had already happened in a way they could not ignore. What mattered now was what I did with it, how I chose to move forward, how I defined the structure I had been given, and as I started walking, the folder no longer in my hands but carried in something less visible, I understood something I had not fully grasped before, that this was never about the will or the envelope or even the assets, it was about timing, about being seen at the exact moment it could no longer be dismissed, and they would never laugh the same way again.